Dr. Howard C. Estep, our Bible teacher, is ready to begin his 40th verse-by-verse lesson from the book of Genesis, and he will start with chapter 43, verse 1.
I have a lesson outlined for you. It's very simple. It's divided into 5 parts. 1, decision to return to Egypt. That's chapter 43, verses 1 through 2. Number 2, Jacob persuaded to meet the demands of Joseph. That's verses 3 through 14. And number 3, the second trip down into Egypt, verses 15 through 17. And number 4, Jacob's family afraid. They were afraid to go down into Egypt the second time, and that's verses 18 through 25. And then the last part of our lesson, the 5th one, is their meeting with Joseph, verses 26 through 34. So we shall begin our lesson at this hour. Genesis chapter 43, we're looking at verse 1. Our first part is decision to return to Egypt. Verse 1, and the famine was sore in the land. This famine had increased in intensity, and the famine was of great scope. In fact, the whole land of Canaan was affected by the famine. But down in Egypt, there was no famine. So we have them now in verses 1 through 2. They've made a decision to go back down into Egypt to get corn. Verse 1, and the famine was sore in the land, and it came to pass when they had eaten up the corn which they had brought out of Egypt. When they went down the first time, they got a supply of corn. Now they've gone back to the land of Canaan, and they have consumed all of that corn. According to verse 2, they had eaten up the corn which they had brought out of Egypt. Their father said unto them, go again, buy us a little corn. So now they're instructed to go back down into Egypt to buy some more corn. This famine, which we're speaking of here in verse 2, was about a year after the first visit. This visit that they're now deciding to make was about a year after the first visit, or 2 years after the famine began. In other words, the famine has been going for about 2 years in the land of Canaan, and naturally nothing has grown, and so they are completely out of grain. So now in verses 1 through 2, the family makes a decision. Let's go back down into Egypt to buy some corn. So we move to our second part, and Jacob persuaded to meet the demands of Joseph. This is verses 3 through 14. And verse 3 says, and Judah spake unto him. This is Judah speaking unto Jacob. The man did solemnly protest unto us, saying, ye shall not see my face, except your brother be with you. Now you see, Joseph the brother is down in Egypt, and he's wanting to see his kinfolk, his brothers, and eventually his father. So he said to his brothers when they came down the first time, according to verse 2, the man did solemnly, according to verse 3, they solemnly did protest unto him, saying, ye shall not see my face, Joseph speaking, except your brother be with you. So Joseph has this tremendous lingering to see his brothers, and so he's saying to his other brothers, when you come again, be sure you bring your brothers with you. And now Judah is reiterating this to his aged father, and he's saying that when we were down there the first time, the man said, don't come back unless you bring your brother. We move to verse 4. If thou wilt send our brother with us, we will go down and buy thee food. So Joseph is saying to Jacob, we will go down the second time to Egypt to buy food, providing you let all of the brothers go with us. That's what verse 4 is telling us. We move to verse 5. But if thou wilt not send him, we will not go down. If you don't send these brothers, we're not going to go down because the man said to us, in so many words in our modern 20th century vernacular, if you don't send him down here, you ain't going to get no corn. That's what he's telling them, or what he did tell them in so many words. Verse 5. But if thou wilt not send him, we will not go down. For the man said unto us, Ye shall not see my face. Joseph said, I'll not see you. I'll have nothing to do with you. Ye shall not see my face, except your brother be with you. Isn't that amazing, the family tie there? Here's Joseph. He's been down in Egypt now for a number of years. The great famine is sweeping all over the land of Canaan. And Joseph is desirous of seeing his brother and his other members of his family. And he's just putting the screws on them, as it were. He's tightening up the screws, as it were. And he says to them, listen here, if you don't bring your brothers, you're not going to get any corn. That's what he's saying here in verse 5. Ye shall not see my face, except your brother be with you. Verse 6, and Israel said, this Israel is Jacob. You know, Jacob wrestled all night with God, and then his name was changed from Jacob to Israel. So when you see Israel here, it's talking about Jacob. And Jacob said, Wherefore dealt ye so ill with me, as to tell the man whether ye had yet a brother? In other words, the aged father is saying, well, why did you do this? Why did you tell the man down there that you had some brothers? Why did you do that? Why didn't you keep your mouth shut? Now you're going to get the answer in verse 7. And they said, the man asked us straightly. The man just came right out and he asked us straightly of our state and of our kindred, saying, Is your brother yet alive? You would think that they had smelled a rat somewhere along the way, wouldn't you? Because here they are down in Egypt in a strange land, and they're talking to this man who is in charge of the distribution of the corn in the country of Egypt. And this man is asking them, Have ye another brother? Because Joseph knew he had another brother. And these fellas must have thought something along the way, because this man keeps asking them those intimate questions. It's rather interesting, isn't it? Have ye another brother? And we told him according to the tenor of these words. Could we certainly know that he would say, Bring your brother down? We had no way of knowing when we confessed to him that we had a brother. We didn't have any way of knowing that he would say, well, bring your brother down with you when you come back. You see how God is moving in this situation? God is going to bring this family together, and God is going to unite them again, and God is going to heal their wounds of separation. Isn't this marvelous how God works? Beautiful. Notice verse 8. And Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, said, And Judah said unto Israel, his father, Send the lad with me. Now this lad was Benjamin. And Benjamin, though he's called a lad, he was approximately 30 years of age at that time. But you see, people lived a long time in those days. 100 years, 120, 150 years of age. So a boy or a man at 30 years of age would just be a lad. So the scripture is written in that vernacular, verse 8, Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go that we may live. Judah is talking to Jacob, the father, and he says, we're out of corn. We've got to have food. There's a famine on in the land of Canaan. It's been going for about 2 years. Nobody's raising any corn. So let's let Benjamin, the lad, go with me, because we've got to live. We've got to get corn. That's in the middle of verse 8. Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and thou, and also our little ones. So there's a matter of self-preservation here. And so Judah is making that tremendous appeal to his aged father. Let's let Benjamin go with us, because Joseph, on the first visit when they went down there, he demanded that they bring the other boys, the other brothers down, because Joseph is homesick. I don't know whether you've ever been homesick or not, but let me tell you, there's only one other sickness as bad as homesickness. Homesickness, well, you don't want to eat, you don't sleep well, and there's only one other sickness, and that's seasickness. And I've experienced both of them. And I believe that Joseph, down in Egypt, though he was the prime minister of Egypt, and he had the responsibility of dispensing the grains which they had stored up for 7 years, I believe that he was very homesick to see his family up in the land of Canaan. Now notice what it says in verse 9. I will be surety for him. This is Judah talking. I will be surety for him. Judah saying, I will stand bond, as it were, for Benjamin. I will be surety for him. Of my hand shalt thou require him. If I bring him not unto thee, and set him before thee, then let me bear the blame forever. There's a situation here that has to be overcome. The father is wanting to hang on to Benjamin because he lost Joseph. And I've heard it said, and I don't know how true it is, I can't really back this up, but when a man gets old and he's in his declining, decrepit days prior to his deceasement, he has a longing to be with his family. He wants his loved ones, the ones that have come the fruit of his loins. He wants to be near them, and he wants them to be near him. And he had lost Joseph. He lost him. As far as Jacob knows, Joseph is dead. And so he doesn't want to lose Benjamin. And that's why he's saying here, at least Judah, is putting himself up as a bond in verse 9. He says, I will stand good for Benjamin. And then he says in the last part of verse 9, then let me bear the blame forever. If I don't come back with Benjamin, then Dad, you can put the blame on me, and I'll bear the blame forever. I'm going to stand good for him. But I feel that we got to take Benjamin down there. If we don't, we're in trouble, because the man said, bring your brothers. And in an unguarded moment, we told him how many brothers we had. And we told him about you, Dad. We told him about you, our aged father. And that man down in Egypt, he knows all about our family. So we've got to go down there, and I need to take these other members of the family down there to show him. I don't know why he wants them. He wants to see them. Let's move into verse 10. For except we had lingered, surely now we had returned this second time. Verse 11. And their father Israel said unto them, if it must be so now, do this. Take of the best fruits in the land in your vessels, and carry down the man a present. The aged father has this something about him. He wants to recompense this man down in Egypt who has been so good to them. He says, take the best fruits of the land and carry down the man a present. A little balm, and a little honey, spices, and myrrh, nuts, and almonds. Much like a fruit package that you would get at the local highway stand where they sell fruits and nuts and so forth. The old man is having a basket packed as a little token of friendship to give this stranger down in Egypt for having been so good to them. Verse 12. And notice what he says now. This is interesting. And take double money in your hand. This phrase, double money, shows the honesty of Jacob. Jacob was honest in a sense. Take double money, showing the honesty of Jacob. Perhaps Joseph wanted to test his brethren to see if they had become honest. So he had given their money back to them. He had put their money in the mouth of their sack originally when they were down there the first time, you remember. Now the father is saying, when you go down this time, take these presents, take Benjamin, but also take double money. Take back the money that they put in the mouth of our sacks when you came back the first time, but also take enough money to buy corn this time, double money. Verse 12, and take double money in your hands, and the money that was brought again in the mouth of your sacks, carry it again in your hand. Peradventure, it was an oversight. Maybe the man made a mistake. That's rather interesting. He might have suspected something, but on the other hand, he's saying maybe it was an oversight. Verse 13, take also your brother. Take Benjamin, this boy that I love, spoken of here in one of the verses as a lad, in verse 8 as a lad. Take also your brother, and arise, go again unto the man. Verse 14, and God Almighty give you mercy before the man. Now this shows the godliness of Jacob. You'll notice every time Jacob was on a mountain peak, he went down into a valley. But then when you're in a valley, you always go back up to a mountain peak. And you'll notice when you study the history of Jacob, when he was in a mountain peak experience, he always glorified God. We have him in several occasions at Bethel, building a rock altar, pouring oil over the rocks, and having a religious service. Now he's saying, here in verse 14, he's pronouncing the apostolic benediction upon him in a sense. Not literally, but in a sense, he's pronouncing a godly benediction upon them, because he says in verse 14, and God Almighty give you mercy before the man. May God have mercy upon you. And may God overshadow all of the circumstances around which you will encounter when you go down into Egypt. You know, that's the right attitude. That's the correct way. Whenever we're involved in something that we don't fully understand, by all means, bring God into the picture. And let God's way sway the minds of the people. And God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may send away your other brother and Benjamin. If I be bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. So the old man is saying, I don't want to lose all my children. I lost Joseph. I don't want to lose Benjamin. And I'm just going to commit this into the hands of God. And as you travel down into Egypt, and evidently they went by camel and they walked, and they might have had some donkeys to carry the load of corn back up out of Egypt. We don't know. Well, we do know the customs of the people in that day and age. And so the old man is just going to commit him to God. And that's what he does here in verse 14. So Jacob persuaded to meet the demands of Joseph. We move into the third part of our lesson, and this is the second trip down into Egypt, and it begins in verse 15 through 17. Verse 15 says, and the men took that present. They took the presents that the father had suggested over in verse 11. In verse 11, the best fruits, and then he also suggested a little balm, some honey, some spices, some myrrh, some nuts, and some almonds. Now in verse 15, and the men took that present, and they took double money in their hand, and Benjamin, and rose up, and went down into Egypt, and stood before Joseph. This is a monumental experience. These Hebrew men, they're living up in Canaan. There's a famine going on up there. They haven't raised anything for almost, a full 2 years. There haven't been any crops grown. And they're out of grain. People are hungry. People are suffering. And so now they have left Canaan. They've gone down into the land of Egypt. They have done exactly as their aged father has told them. They have taken the presents that he suggested. He has placed His benediction upon them. And there they are, down in Egypt, and they're standing there in the magnificent room of the house occupied by Joseph, the long-lost son, whom they thought had been killed because they didn't really know. They had sold him into slavery. You know, they sold him to the camel train caravan, and the man in the house of Pharaoh bought Joseph from the camel train caravan rulers or owners, and so they don't know all of the details. So here they are standing in this magnificent, splendid room of Joseph, the Israelitish brother from the land of Canaan. Isn't that beautiful? Beautiful. And you see, God is in all of this. Because Joseph originally had the dream, you know, and he dreamed that there was going to be a time when his brothers would bow down to him, etc. You remember in the first part of our study of the book of Genesis when we were studying the life of Joseph. Now the brothers had in a sense forgotten all of this. Now God is getting ready to bring this to pass. And you know what this does for me? It makes me put my complete dependence upon God, for God, some way, somehow, will bring to pass exactly what God's Word says God will do. And we're going to see it marvelously unfold as we continue our study in the life of Joseph, week by week, verse by verse. So they're standing now in verse 15 before Joseph. Verse 16 says, and when Joseph saw Benjamin with them. Now Joseph wanted to see Benjamin all the time. And when Joseph saw Benjamin standing with them, he said to the ruler of his house, the caretaker of his house, the man who was in charge, bring these men home. And what does he mean? Well, Joseph was so busy with his duties that he could not pay attention to them in the time of the formality of business. So he said to the ruler of his house, bring these men to my house. In other words, he wants to get closer to them. He wants to talk over some things with them. And even though he saw Benjamin with them, he also wished to remain unidentified. He was fearful of breaking down and revealing himself before them in public. I don't know whether you've ever been away for a long time from your family or not. I was away from my family one time for, almost 3.5 years. I never saw my sisters, my mother and my dad. And then when I saw them upon my coming home after being away for 3.5 years, I just took my dad and my mom in my arms and I just hugged them and I squeezed them to me and I just stood there and sobbed. I wept, and then later on I took my 2 sisters in my arms and I just hugged them. I couldn't say anything. I'll tell you, there's a tie, that's the blood tie, that's hard to sever. And though Joseph is down in Egypt as the prime minister, administering the house of Pharaoh, and yet when his poor, destitute family come down from Canaan, he has compassion upon them. He's moved. Down inside his inner parts quiver because of that love he has for his family. You'll notice here in the middle of verse 16, he says, bring these men home. Bring them home and slay and make ready, for these men shall dine with me at noon. I'm going to prepare a feast. You know what this sounds like? This sounds like the prodigal son in reverse. Think about that. When the prodigal son came home, it was the father who slew the calf and made a big feast. Now the Israelitish family of Jacob are down in Egypt. Part of them, not the father, but part of the family. Now it's the son, the not necessarily the prodigal son, but the son who seemingly is gone away, who is dead. It's the son who's making the feast. Because it says there, in the latter part of verse 16, notice it very carefully, and make ready, slay and make ready, for these men shall dine with me at noon. And if I know the Egyptians, they really put on a feast. Oh, I can see that spread of food, melons, fruits, lamb. All of the delicacies of Egypt are spread out there in front of these Israelites. And you know, I don't think I'd be wrong in thinking that Joseph maybe had this food prepared so they could eat it properly. So it wouldn't be from a pagan standpoint that they would be willing to eat this fruit, this food. Now that's the way I got it figured out in my own mind. For these men shall dine with me at noon, verse 17. And the man did as Joseph bade or ordered. This is the man who's in charge of Joseph's household. He did exactly as Joseph told him. And the man brought the men into Joseph's house. And you know what I believe? I believe that when the family of Joseph came into the house of Joseph, Joseph had the doors shut. And I believe that he dismissed any Egyptian servants he might have. He just dismissed them. He said, will you come back in an hour, 2 hours, or whatever it was? Why? I believe that Joseph wanted to be alone with his brothers. Let's just see Jacob's family afraid in verses 18 through 25. They were afraid. Now these brothers are in Joseph's house. This is the family of Jacob, these brothers. They've come down from Canaan. They're down in Egypt. They're now in the house of Joseph. Now, they are afraid because they don't know what's going to happen. Because the door is shut, evidently. There they are in Egypt. They're in the house with this man. Up to now, they haven't called him Joseph. They said, this man said so-and-so. This man commanded so-and-so. So now they're in the house with this man. So we have Jacob's family afraid in verses 18 through 25. Verse 18 says, and the men were afraid. Why? Well, they did not know what fate awaited them. They didn't know what was going to happen next. The men were afraid because they were brought into Joseph's house, and they said, because of the money that was returned in our sacks at the first time, are we brought in? They thought now, because this money that was in the sacks when we were down here the first time, we believe that possibly this is why he has us in the house. He's going to have us arrested, have us tried, and have us, put in prison according to the laws of Egypt. They didn't know. I know if I was snatched up and taken to a foreign land and I was thrown in the house of a big dignitary of a foreign country and you would react like I would react, we wouldn't know what was going to happen. Well, these fellas didn't. Notice what it says here in the middle of verse 18. Because of the money that was returned in our sacks at the first time, are we brought in that he may seek occasion against us and fall upon us and take us for bondmen and our asses. Take us as prisoners, as slaves, and take our beasts of burden. Take everything we got and put us in prison. Verse 19. And they came near to the steward of Joseph's house, and they communed with him at the door of the house, and said, O sir, we came indeed down at the first time to buy food. Evidently, the steward of Joseph's house remembered them, and they remembered him. And they're saying, you remember when we came down the first time to buy food? Verse 21, and it came to pass when we came to the inn that we opened our sacks, and behold, every man's money was in the mouth of his sack. So they are confessing ahead of time, actually showing honesty. And this honesty really gladdened the heart of Joseph. And they're saying that when we got on our way and we stopped and we opened our sacks, we found the money in there. So they're confessing this ahead of time to try to clear their conscience, to alleviate any punishment that might be going to be unleashed upon them. And behold, every man's money was in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight, and we have brought it again in our hand. Here's the money. We want to pay you back. When we opened our corns, our sacks of corn, and we looked opened up the mouth of the sack, we saw the money in there. Listen, somebody's made a mistake. Here's the money. Honesty. They didn't want to get in trouble. Honesty. No, sirree, they didn't want to get into trouble. And other money have we brought down in our hands to buy food. We brought second amount of money. The first money that was in the sacks on the first visit, we've got that. Now we've got some other money. This is verse 22. And other money have we brought down in our hands to buy food. We cannot tell who put our money in our sacks. We don't know who did that. And he said, this is the steward of Joseph's household talking to Joseph's family in verse 23. Now notice, he's going to bring peace to them. He said, peace be to you. Fear not. Your God and the God of your father hath given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money, and he brought Simeon out unto them. Joseph's steward brought Simeon out to them, proving that he had full instruction to do so. This would be the first act to calm their fears. Simeon was left there. Now they have Simeon. And the steward is saying that I have your money. Don't worry a thing about it. We're going to clear this whole thing up. Verse 24. And the man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water. That's about the most precious thing that you could get in Egypt on a hot day. Would be a drink of cold water. You've been walking through the dusty desert of Egypt, and you know Egypt is about 15/16 desert. Did you ever stop to think of that? Practically 4/5 of the population of Egypt live on the banks of the Nile. When you get out into the desert area, there isn't any water. These fellows have been coming down through the desert from Canaan. And now the first thing that they are given is water by the steward of Joseph's house, and gave them water, verse 24, and they washed their feet. I think they drank some first. I know I would have. I'm sure they're smarter than I would be. I'm just going out on a limb, and I'm just sure they drank a lot of water, quenched their thirst, and then they washed their feet because they had sandals on, or they might have been barefooted. Who knows? They washed their feet, and he gave them, or gave their asses, their animals, food or provender. So he gave the animals food. They're going to be put away to rest and to eat. The men are going to sit down to a banquet table. They're going to eat. It's going to be much like the feast of the marriage supper up in heaven. They're going to sit down there with their long-lost brother, though they don't know he's the long-lost brother at this time. Verse 24, and they made ready the present against Joseph came at noon. So Joseph is coming at noon. He had sent the men on over, his brothers, on over to his house by the steward of his house. Now Joseph is going to get there at noon, for they heard that they should eat bread there. He's going to have the feast there. So we have Jacob's family afraid. And the reason they were afraid, because they had double money. They left Simeon behind. They really don't know who this man is they're dealing with in Egypt, who has befriended them somewhat. They don't know whether he has tricked them or not. So they've tried through the steward of Joseph's household to clarify all of this and to make everything right, so there wouldn't be any chance of misunderstanding. So now we move into their meeting with Joseph. They're going to meet Joseph in verses 26 through 34. And verse 26 says, "And when Joseph came home," this is at the noon hour, "they brought him the present which was in their hand into the house." So they had a present for the old man. And the present is back in verse 11, if you want to take a little look. The present was a little balm and some honey, some spices and some myrrh, some nuts and some almonds and some fruit. They had all of this down in Egypt. But this was a token of goodwill. So they brought the presents and gave them to Joseph. Now notice what happens in verse 26, the middle of verse 26. And this is the fulfillment of prophecy. The prophecy that got Joseph into problems earlier in his life when his brothers got angry at him and they called him the dreamer and they threw him in a pit. Then they got him out of the pit and they sold him to the Ishmaelite camel caravan. Now notice, God is going to bring to pass exactly what Joseph predicted in his early prophecy. In the middle of verse 26, they're in Joseph's house, second trip down, the middle of verse 26, "and bowed themselves to him to the earth." They bowed down to Joseph there in Joseph's house down in Egypt. Bowed down. This is Joseph's dream being fulfilled, which was prophesied in the 37th chapter, verses 5 through 11. "And bowed themselves to him to the earth," verse 27, "and he asked them of their welfare." Joseph talking to his brothers and said, "Is your father well?" Joseph loved his father. He had sweet memories of his father. "Is your father well?" Now, on a transaction like this, a commercial transaction down in Egypt, you wouldn't think that the official of the government would be asking about your father. I know when I go up to the Automobile License Bureau here in Southern California to renew the tags for my car every year, the attendant never says, "How's your father, Mr. Estep?" You see, there had to be a special connection with Joseph because he wants to know, "Is your father well? The old man of whom ye speak? Is he yet alive? Is he living?" Verse 28, "And they answered, Thy servant, our father, is in good health, and he is yet alive." Now watch what's going to happen again. Notice, second fulfillment. "And they bowed down their heads and made obeisance." So they bowed down. Once again, they fulfilled Joseph's dream of 37 verses 5 through 11. When they said, "Yes, our father's well, he's yet alive," and then they bow down to the ground. They pay homage to Joseph. And Joseph predicted this, and this is what got him into trouble in the first place. Notice verse 29. "And he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother," Joseph. He hasn't seen his brother for a long, long time. "He saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your younger brother? Is this your younger brother of whom you spake unto me?" Benjamin's about 30 years of age, remember. "Is this your younger brother?" And he said, "God be gracious unto thee, my son." Joseph is glad to see Benjamin. "God be gracious unto you, my son," verse 30. "And Joseph made haste." Now watch what's going to happen. "And Joseph made haste, For his bowels did yearn upon his brother. His compassion, his innermost being was disturbed. There was a tremendous revolt going on inside his heart and his soul and his mind. And he sought where to weep. He was at the breaking point. Isn't it amazing that God has so arranged that when we get to the emotional point where it seems like our body will just come apart, God has behind the eyes a little sack of water behind each eyeball, and that little sack of water opens up and a tear comes down the cheek. And you know that little drop of water that runs down from the corner of the eye, down the cheek, down to the tip of the chin and falls off into the dust of the earth. That little drop of water has such a magnificent power about it that it relieves even the soul. Haven't you heard people say after they had a good cry, "Oh, forgive me, I just had to cry." And then they say, "Oh, I feel better all over." Joseph had this this emotion pent up in him all of these years, wanting to see his family. He wanted to see if these boys still hated him like they did earlier in life, when they were willing to throw him into an abandoned water well, when they were willing to sell him to the Ishmaelite camel caravan traders. He wanted to know, are my brothers like that today? And evidently he was pretty well convinced that they weren't. And so now he says, notice what it says here in the middle of verse 30, and he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber. I believe he went into his bedroom. I'm just going to take the permission of King James, and if it's all right, Mr. King James, I'm going to change this chamber to bedroom. And he went into his bedroom, and I believe he threw himself across the bed, and I believe he just wept. Just wept, and he wept, and he wept, until the pressure was relieved in his soul. And notice what happened in verse 31. The next logical thing to do, verse 31. And he washed his face and went out and refrained himself and said, "Set on bread, let's eat." He had his crying spell. He went in, washed his face, bowl of water, towel, washed his face, combed his hair, kind of hidden the redness in his eyes, and then he went marching out to the dining room, and he announced to them there in the reception area, he said, "Come on, let's go eat." Because he's met his brothers. He met his brothers. Now notice what happens in verse 32 through 34 as we continue their meeting with Joseph. We have actually a banquet. A banquet. Verse 32 says, and they set on for him by himself, and for them by themselves, and for the Egyptians. Now this is rather interesting. The system in Egypt was this. The caste system, that's C-A-S-T-E, the system of levels of people in Egypt was in evidence all over that country, and different classes of Egyptians would not eat or live together. And Joseph was of the higher caste, so he had food set for himself, then food for the other Egyptians, and some for the Hebrews by themselves. And that's why I said earlier that I believe that he had the food cooked, prepared, so they could eat it without any spiritual complications. And so we get this here in verse 32. And they sat on for him by himself, and for them by themselves, and for the Egyptians which did eat with him by themselves, because the Egyptians might not eat bread with the Hebrews. For that is an abomination unto the Egyptians. And they sat before him the firstborn, according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men marveled one at another. Now, why would they marvel? You see, Joseph is having his family sit in certain numerical rotation. The fact that Joseph knew their ages and order at meals caused them to marvel in verse 33. Because he was following a custom, and so he knew their ages, and so he's having them sit at this table where they're going to sit according to their ages. And that's why it says in the latter part of verse 33, and the men marveled one at another. Concluding verse 34, and he took and sent messages unto them before him, but Benjamin's mess was 5 times so much as any of theirs. Now, I don't think Benjamin could have eaten all of that, but anyhow, he honored Benjamin by giving him a tremendous portion. And this was perhaps done to see if they were still jealous and could be moved with envy against their younger brother. So here we have these Hebrews sitting in a certain area for their dinner, and then when it comes time to serve Benjamin, he gives him 5 times more than all the others. That's what verse 34 says. And they drank and were merry with him. So evidently they weren't jealous in any way. So in our lesson at this hour, exploring in Genesis chapter 43, we have studied in 5 chronological settings part of the story of Joseph. Our lesson has been divided into 5 parts. 1, we have the decision to return to Egypt, verses 1 through 2. 2, Jacob persuaded to meet the demands of Joseph. That's verses 3 through 14. 3, second trip down into Egypt, verses 15 through 17. And 4, Jacob's family afraid, verses 18 through 25. And lastly, number 5, their meeting with Joseph, verses 26 through 34.
2 more informative messages in the Genesis Bible Study Lecture Series have been presented by Dr. Howard C. Estep, President of World Prophetic Ministry Incorporated at Colton, California. These messages have covered chapter 42, verse 10, through chapter 43, verse 34. This verse-by-verse Bible study continues on cassette number 21.